This is what happens when a country chooses war over its own people. Cucumber prices in Russia jumped 21% during the first 12 days of January 2026. Tomatoes climbed nearly 14%, and potatoes rose almost 6%. And that is only the beginning. Ordinary Russians are now paying the bill for the Kremlin's missiles, drones, and mobilization, not at the front, but at the grocery store. What started as a distant war in Ukraine has arrived home, showing up aisle by aisle and receipt by receipt. Today we look at how Russia's so-called victory is consuming itself from within. A new law hit Russians on January 1, 2026, raising the standard VAT rate from 20 to 22%. Putin signed off on November 28, 2025, just 8 days after the Duma pushed it through. The purpose was blunt. It was to plug a $50 billion budget hole created by military spending. Here's the thing about value-added tax, VAT, in Russia. It accounts for roughly 40% of all government revenue. That meant when the rate climbed, prices followed within days. Rosstat, Russia's official statistics agency, tracked what happened next. Fruits and vegetables jumped nearly 8% in just 12 days. Cucumbers spiked 21.3%. Tomatoes shot up 13.6%. Potatoes increased 5.8%. White cabbage added 4%, and carrots tacked on 3.8%. None of these are luxuries. Pensioners depend on them, families stretch their budgets around them, and low-income households treat them as the basics of daily survival. The numbers reveal something deeper when you compare official claims to lived reality. Russia's government reported year-end inflation for 2025 at 5.59%, but a survey conducted by FOM for the central bank found that consumer perceived inflation stood at 14.5%. That gap of nearly 7 percentage points separates what the Kremlin announces from what Russians actually experience at checkout. Even the IMF estimate of 7.6% average inflation for 2025 ran higher than official figures, and that number likely understates conditions on the ground. Gallup found that 31% of Russians struggled to afford food in 2025, a share significantly larger than a decade earlier. To cope, shoppers have flooded into discount chains and fixed-price stores. Fixed Price alone opened more than 330 new locations since early 2025, pushing their total to 7,500 stores nationwide, while their revenue grew nearly 8% in 2024. When discount retail becomes your fastest-growing sector, that tells you everything about what's happening to purchasing power. Where is all this money going? Russia's 2025 military budget came in at 13.5 trillion rubles on paper, roughly $169 billion at official exchange rates, but actual spending likely topped $198 billion. Defense now swallows 7 to 8% of GDP and commands more than 40% of the federal budget. CPRI tracked the acceleration. Military spending rose 3% over 2024, 31% over 2023, and has nearly tripled since 2022. The Carnegie Endowment explained the mechanism in plain terms. 6 to 8% of GDP pouring into military production created a war rent effect, and inflation followed as military demand slammed into limited production capacity and shrinking imports. Factories churning out shells cannot bake bread. Workers assembling tanks cannot harvest crops. And the money printed to fund all of it chases fewer and fewer goods on store shelves. Gross domestic product growth collapsed from over 4% in 2023 and 2024, down to roughly 1% in 2025, with forecasts for 2026 projecting just 1% to 1.3%. The Kremlin made its choice, and Russian households now carry the cost. Inflation tells only half the story because labor tells the other half. Russia's unemployment rate dropped to a record post-Soviet low of 2.1 to 2.2% by November 2025, and that sounds positive until you understand the reason. This economy is not creating abundance, it is running out of bodies. Mobilization pulled approximately 1 million men out of the civilian workforce, while more than 650,000 fled the country in 2022 alone. Defense contractors, meanwhile, hire aggressively, offering wages that civilian industries cannot match, and the result is companies bidding against each other and against the military for a shrinking labor pool. Manufacturing wages in some regions climbed 78% between February 2022 and February 2025. That sounds like prosperity until you recognize it reflects desperation rather than growth. 1.9 million workers is the shortage Russia's Ministry of Industry and Trade reports for manufacturing alone. Labor Minister Kochetkov warned Putin in July 2025 that 10.9 million workers will be needed by 2030 simply to replace retirees, and between 87 and 90% of Russian companies report they cannot find enough staff. Central Bank Governor Nabiullina put it directly, low unemployment has turned into a labor shortage. Every man sent to the front means one fewer man in a factory, or behind the wheel of a truck, or working a harvest. Every worker pulled into defense production means one fewer worker making the goods ordinary Russians need. What has all this spending purchased? According to the UK Ministry of Defense figures from January 14, 2026, Russia has absorbed approximately 1,213,000 casualties in Ukraine, including roughly 240,000 killed. The year 2025 alone cost Russia around 415,000 casualties, the second highest annual toll after 2024, and by December the daily rate averaged approximately 1,130 men every day. Longer than Russia's participation in World War II, that is how long this war has now lasted. CSYS calculated that Russia has suffered roughly 5 times as many fatalities in Ukraine as in all Russian and Soviet wars combined, from the end of World War II through the start of the full-scale invasion. Maxim Klimov, a retired Russian Navy captain third rank who Russia declared a foreign agent in 2025, ran his own numbers and estimated about 1.5 million Russian soldiers gone, pointing to discrepancies between official contract signings and actual deployed forces. Pro-war. Russian mill bloggers can no longer hide the scale of what is happening. Anastasia Kashevarova admitted that specialists, the handicapped, wounded, and others get sent on one-way assaults, and in some cases they never even reach the objective, calling it needless death. Roman Alekine documented special forces officers, aerospace forces personnel, and sailors thrown into infantry ground assaults because regular soldiers have run out. German journalists at Bild obtained footage from January 2026 showing Russian soldiers with TM-62 anti-tank mines strapped to their body armor, serving as what one reporter called can openers in kamikaze attacks on fortified Ukrainian positions. Euromaidan Press reported similar tactics near Lyman in July 2025, describing specially designed vests that hold anti-tank mines which detonate when Ukrainian fire strikes them, instantly killing the wearer along with anyone nearby. Russia's own state media outlet Izvestia published training footage calling this mine-carrying assault tactic relatively new but very effective. That is what the grocery bills fund. Russia's standing on the world stage keeps degrading alongside everything else. The Washington Post ran an analysis on January 18, 2026. The headline said Putin looks diminished as Russia stands aside while its allies are targeted. Their assessment landed hard. Putin's credibility at home and abroad is crumbling, and as allies like Venezuela, Syria, and Iran get picked off or bombed, his international promises ring more hollow than ever while his lies convince fewer people. January 3, 2026 brought the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by U.S. forces while Russia watched from the sidelines. A Chatham House analyst pointed out that Venezuela had symbolized Russia's global reach, and now all that rhetoric has been thrown spectacularly in the Kremlin's face. Syria's Assad regime collapsed in 2024, and Russia offered little beyond refuge for Assad and his family. Then on January 7, 2026, U.S. forces seized the Marinera, a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic, roughly 190 miles south of Iceland. Coast Guard Cutter Monroe led the operation alongside Navy SEALs and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. What made it worse was that a Russian submarine and a Navy vessel had been escorting that tanker, yet Russia could not or would not stop the seizure. Moscow called it 21st century piracy and did nothing else. Even the relationship with China shows cracks. Bilateral trade fell 6.9% in 2025, marking the first decline since 2020, while crude oil imports from Russia to China dropped 19.6% through the first 11 months. January 2026 brought another blow when China halted electricity imports from Russia entirely over high prices. Alexander Dugin, the far-right Russian ideologue, posted that Russia is obliged to do something horrible to restore her credibility. When ultranationalist voices acknowledge that credibility has been lost, that carries weight. Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen served as Danish Prime Minister from 2001 to 2009, and his interview with the Financial Times on January 17, 2026 delivered a blunt assessment. Trump is using Greenland as a weapon of mass distraction from the real threats, Rasmussen argued, naming Russia's war in Ukraine specifically. He continued by saying that since childhood he had considered the United States the natural leader of the free world. He said he had even spoken about the United States as the world's policeman, and that now the United States uses language pretty close to the gangsters it should control in Moscow, Beijing, and elsewhere. Divisions in the West play into Russian hands, Rasmussen warned, adding that he feels sure Moscow hopes Greenland becomes the iceberg that sinks NATO. That is the strategic backdrop. Attention drifts elsewhere while the war grinds on. Debates consume headlines while Russia burns through manpower at catastrophic rates, and news cycles shift while Russian civilians watch their grocery bills keep climbing. Russia no longer exports the pain of war exclusively outward, because it has started importing that pain back home. Ukrainian fields hold Russian casualties while Russian store shelves empty from inflation. Factories lack workers, allies fall away, credibility crumbles, the deficit swells, and the value-added tax climbed again. Food inflation does not function as a side effect here. It functions as a warning sign. Any country that cannot shield its civilians from hunger while claiming stability is already paying the price of its own aggression. Credibility underwrites power, and credibility lost proves hard to rebuild. None of this marks the end of Russia's problems, because this marks only the beginning. A war that was supposed to last days now approaches its fourth year, and the promised victory has become a wound that will not stop bleeding on the battlefield and at home. Putin's war has come home, and Russia is eating itself.